So if Republicans want to see a absolute victory in November, Nikki Haley is the best choice, and that helps up and down the ballot. And when we look at the debates that are going on in Congress, you want to make sure there's really big coattails to keep the House in Republicans' hands. Right now, we're basically at a two. Republicans only have a two-seat majority.
Yeah.
That can potentially flip in November. Senate looks good for Republicans taking over. So if you want to see conservative leadership in Washington, D.C. and getting things done, I think Nikki has the best chance, and that's the case she's been making throughout these early states.
I'm going to throw this at you before I change the topic to what's happening here in Washington, and would love your take on that as we spend time with Will Hurd. The Emerson poll out of South Carolina out Friday shows a tough go for Nikki Haley in her home state. 25% to Donald Trump's 54%. There's been a lot of talk about some of the confusion surrounding her answer on what caused the Civil War recently. Is that going to be a deficit for her in South Carolina? And how important will that state be for her potential to move forward?
She's made it very clear that the Civil War, the reason for the Civil War was slavery. She has talked about her mistake and not having that be the first thing that came out of her mouth. I think many of her opponents are using that in order to try to create drama and to stop that momentum that she's been seeing. But I think you're going to start seeing momentum continue to build in Iowa and New Hampshire as she goes into her home state that she knows incredibly well. And so, this is, as you said at the top of this conversation, it's exciting that we're soon going to get to have to not worrying about what polls are saying and seeing what voters are actually saying. Because I will say this. If you look at some of the polling versus votes of significant votes over the last, let's call it 9 months, the abortion ballot initiative in Iowa, the gubernatorial race in Kentucky, the polling did not reflect what actually happened at the ballot box. And so this is going to come down to who has the best organized campaign and when voters were finally thinking about, what do we want? Do we want, 4 more years of chaos? Or do we want someone who's thoughtful, who understands foreign policy? Do we want an accountant in the White House so that we start actually getting our financial house in order?
Well, I'll tell you, the story here in Washington today is not so much about the presidential campaign, who the next president will be, but whether we're going to have a government shutdown in a couple of weeks. And I know that there's now an agreement on top line spending. It's the same agreement we had in the debt ceiling deal. So I have to admit, I don't know if there's even much reason to talk about it because it doesn't feel like progress. Jim Lankford, though, says there is progress on the border, Will Hurd. Last time you were here, there was a hope that this might be done by the end of the year. It, of course, would help to unlock funding for Ukraine, but would bring a long-sought compromise on border security and on immigration reform, on asylum law. Are you as optimistic now as you were a couple of weeks ago here? Because we're hearing from negotiators, including Lankford, that there could be text by the end of this week.
Look, Langford is a serious guy. He's a thoughtful guy. He's not someone, he's not going to say that if they're not close to some kind of deal. But we have to look at all this stuff together. And I agree with you. The top line numbers is an agreement to agree to the last numbers. And that's going to require the House to then you got to actually write the bill that matches that number. And let's be frank, the conservatives in the House that are criticizing this again have never voted to fund the government. So the fact that there's going to be something that appeases them is just ridiculous. It's, can Speaker Johnson get half the Republicans to vote for it, and are Democrats willing to participate? But you got to be able to have a government open in order to get this side deal to deal with supplemental funding between Ukraine and the border. The border is continuing to be a crisis. I'm always going to be hopeful that something gets done because the communities along the border have been suffering for 5 years. We think about, most people only think, when New York and Chicago and LA started complaining, that's when it really became a crisis. No, it's been a crisis. It's been a crisis since the last year of Donald Trump's presidency. He's the one that began this problem, and then it just became considerably worse under President Biden. Last month, I think it was 320,000 people were apprehended. That's the all-time high in the history of our government. So this is a real
Yeah, we're seeing
crisis.
some staggering figures, that's for sure. And I wonder if you think it's a good time then to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary. The first hearing will take place in the House on Wednesday. Alejandro Mayorkas, of course, is seated at the negotiating table, we're told, at least, helping to represent the administration. Is this the moment to pull the plug on the secretary?
Look, if I was President Biden, and let me be frank, I'm not one to generally give him advice that's good for him. If I'm Joe Biden, I would fire Secretary Mayorkas. When you look at some of his bad polling numbers, especially in a general election against general election voters, a significant amount of the drag on Joe Biden is his bungling of the border crisis. And so this is, there's a lot of Democrats that are frustrated with Secretary Mayorkas. And just look at the record. This is the worst the border crisis has been in our country's history. We've had over 5 million people come into our country illegally under Secretary Mayorkas. The data shows he's done a terrible job. And I am of the opinion that they have not been actually implementing legislation appropriately. We've made it very clear what asylum is supposed to be. They're having an incredibly generous definition of asylum, which is allowing these millions of people to come into the country. And to me, that alone is a violation of Secretary Mayorkas's duties.